Maria was a 60-year-old woman who had lived most of her life with quiet dignity. She had raised her son Daniel on her own after her husband passed away when Daniel was still a boy. She worked long hours as a cleaner in offices and sometimes took extra jobs just to make sure there was food on the table and school fees were paid. She never complained, because she believed that sacrifice was part of being a mother. Over the years she hoped her son would understand the value of respect and kindness. She prayed he would grow into a man who carried the same heart she had always tried to give him. But as Daniel grew older, something inside him changed. When Daniel was in his late teens, he began to spend more time with boys from the neighborhood who did not share the same values Maria tried to teach. They laughed loudly, spoke carelessly, and often showed off as if life was only about pride and power. Maria noticed the changes in her son, but she told herself it was just a phase. She believed that deep down, Daniel's heart was still good. She never stopped cooking his favorite meals or asking him if he was all right, even when he rolled his eyes and ignored her words. On one particular evening, Daniel brought some of his friends home. Maria had spent the whole afternoon cleaning the house and preparing food for them. She set the table with simple dishes she could afford, rice and stew with a little bread. When the boys came inside, they looked around with mocking eyes. One of them whispered something, and they all laughed. Daniel looked embarrassed by his small home, embarrassed by his mother who wore her old faded clothes, and embarrassed by the way she served them with humility. Instead of defending her, he decided to act differently. As Maria bent down to pick up a tray of glasses, Daniel suddenly pushed her away with his leg. His friends burst out laughing as she stumbled and almost fell. He raised his voice, pretending to be a tough man in front of them, and shouted, "Can't you see I'm with my friends? Stop acting like a servant." The words cut deeper than the push. Maria froze for a moment, her hands trembling as she steadied herself. She felt her heart pound inside her chest, not from the pain in her body but from the shame that filled the room. Her son had never raised his hand or his foot against her before. To do it in front of strangers felt like a knife twisting into her soul. She looked at him, her eyes wide, and for a second she thought he might apologize. But Daniel only smirked because his friends were watching. The laughter around her sounded like thunder. She lowered her head and quietly went to the kitchen, leaving them to their noise. Inside the small kitchen, Maria leaned against the counter and held her breath. Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She thought of the nights she had gone without sleep, holding a feverish Daniel in her arms. She thought of the mornings when she left before sunrise, walking long distances to her job so she could buy him books and clothes. She remembered how she stitched his school uniform with her own hands when money was short. All of it flashed before her, and now her only son treated her as if she were nothing. When the boys finally left, Maria cleaned up the mess quietly. Daniel didn't help, he was too busy bragging about jokes his friends made. Later, when the house was silent, Maria sat on the edge of her bed. She looked at the cracked walls and the small lamp that flickered faintly. Her heart felt heavy, but she also felt a spark of strength inside her. For the first time, she realized she could not continue living like this. She whispered to herself, "He thinks I am weak because I stay quiet. But silence is not weakness." That night, Maria didn't sleep much. She lay awake, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Every sound reminded her of time passing. 60 years of her life had already gone, and she had little to show except a son who no longer respected her. She asked herself if she had failed as a mother, but then she remembered the kindness of her own parents, who had always told her that dignity could not be stolen unless one allowed it. Slowly, she decided she would not let Daniel's cruelty define her. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. She prepared breakfast for him and placed it on the table. Daniel didn't even say thank you. He grabbed the food and left with a laugh, meeting his friends outside. Maria watched him from the window, her face calm but her mind deep in thought. She knew he believed she would always forgive, that she would always serve, that she would always remain quiet. He had no idea that his action had planted a seed in her heart, a seed of change. In the days that followed, Maria noticed the whispers of neighbors. One woman from across the street had seen what happened through the window. Others had heard the shouting. Maria walked past them with her head held high, even though she felt their pity. She didn't want pity. She wanted respect. She told herself that revenge was not about anger or violence. It was about standing up for her own worth and showing Daniel that every action has a consequence. Maria's body was tired, her hair turning white, but her spirit began to grow stronger. She thought about the little savings she had kept hidden in a box under her bed. She thought about the piece of land her parents had left her long ago, a piece Daniel had never cared about. She thought about her neighbor, who often spoke about starting a small business and looking for someone honest to partner with. Slowly, Maria began to imagine a different future, one where she was not trapped under her son's arrogance but free to live with dignity. For now, she kept her plans inside her heart. She continued her daily routines, cooking, cleaning, and going to her part-time work. Daniel thought she had already forgotten his cruelty, but each time Maria saw him laugh with his friends, she remembered. Each time he walked past her without greeting, she felt her resolve harden. She would not shout or fight. She would wait, and when the time came, her revenge would not be loud. It would be silent, steady, and strong. The evening of that shameful day remained carved in her memory like a scar. It was the moment when she stopped being only a mother who gave and forgave. It was the moment she became a woman preparing to reclaim her respect. Maria knew that Daniel had destroyed a piece of her trust, but he had also awakened something in her he never expected. She whispered again to herself before falling asleep, "He will learn. One day, he will learn." Maria carried the pain of that evening in silence, but inside her, something had changed forever. The humiliation of being pushed and insulted by her own son in front of strangers was not something she could simply forget. Yet, instead of drowning in sorrow, she began to think deeply. Each night, when Daniel was out with his friends, she sat alone in her small room and allowed her thoughts to wander. She replayed the moment again and again, not to hurt herself but to remind herself of what she must never allow again. Her eyes no longer carried only sadness, they also carried determination. Daniel thought his mother had already moved on. He believed her silence meant forgiveness, as it always had before. But Maria's quietness this time was different. She no longer looked at him with the same soft eyes. She had begun to measure every word, every step, and every possibility for her future. She realized she had spent her entire life pouring love and sacrifice into someone who did not value her, and now it was time to pour some of that strength into herself. Each morning, she continued her routine like always. She rose before sunrise, cooked a simple meal, and went to work cleaning offices. But this time, her mind was not just on the tasks of the day. She began to think about the savings she had hidden carefully over the years. Every coin, every bill she had tucked away was suddenly more important than ever. It was no longer just a backup for emergencies, it was a key to her freedom. At work, Maria listened carefully to conversations around her. She paid attention to how her employers spoke about business, money, and investments. These were things she never cared for before, but now they became lessons. Her mind, once focused only on survival, began to dream of building something that could support her and protect her from ever depending on her son again. In the evenings, when Daniel returned with his friends, Maria stayed out of sight. She no longer rushed to serve them with food or drinks. She no longer tried to make them comfortable. Daniel noticed her distance, but he thought little of it. To him, she was still the mother who would always stay. But Maria's silence was heavy with meaning. Each day, she grew stronger in her decision. She remembered the small piece of land her parents had left her in their village. For years, it had been nothing but soil and weeds, ignored and unused. Daniel had once laughed when she mentioned it, saying it was worthless. But Maria now saw it differently. It was not just land, it was an opportunity. She decided she would visit the village and speak to people she trusted about its value. One weekend, when Daniel was away, Maria traveled quietly to the village. She walked across the land, touching the soil with her hands. Memories of her childhood came rushing back, playing in the fields, running barefoot, watching her parents work hard with pride. She felt tears in her eyes, but this time they were not only of sadness. She realized the land was more than property, it was a piece of her identity. She could sell it if needed or use it to start something. For the first time in years, Maria felt a sense of power. Back in the town, Maria began meeting her neighbor Clara more often. Clara was a kind woman who sold handmade clothes and small household goods at the local market. Maria had always admired her determination. One evening, Clara spoke about how her business was growing, but she lacked enough money to expand. Maria listened carefully and asked questions. Clara was surprised at her interest, but she explained everything. That night, Maria thought about how her savings, combined with Clara's hard work, could create something meaningful. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior grew worse. He came home late, often drunk, and sometimes with friends who mocked Maria openly. Once, one of them laughed at her clothes and Daniel joined in. Maria felt her heart tighten, but she did not respond with anger. She only observed, storing each insult as fuel for the fire of her quiet resolve. She knew that one day, the tables would turn. One morning, Maria sat at the table with her savings box open before her. She counted every bill carefully, her hands steady. The amount was not much, but it was enough to take the first step. She told herself that dignity was not bought with wealth but with choices. And she was ready to choose differently now. In the following weeks, Maria began visiting banks and asking questions. She walked into places Daniel never thought she belonged. The clerks looked at her with surprise, but Maria stood tall. She asked about loans, investments, and property sales. She may not have had fine clothes or polished words, but she had courage. Each answer she received gave her more clarity. She began to see that the future she wanted was possible. At home, Daniel noticed small changes. The house no longer smelled of fresh meals every evening. His clothes were washed less often. The little comforts he had always taken for granted were fading. He grew annoyed, but Maria remained calm. She no longer rushed to please him. Instead, she spent her evenings writing notes, making plans, and meeting with Clara. One night, Daniel confronted her. "Why don't you cook like before? Why are you always busy with papers? Are you losing your mind?" he asked with a laugh. Maria looked at him quietly and replied, "I am finding my mind." Daniel didn't understand and dismissed her words, but they stayed with him. Maria's heart was heavy with disappointment in her son, but her spirit was no longer broken. She realized that her revenge would not come from shouting at him or punishing him in the way he expected. It would come from building a life that left him behind. She would rise silently, and when he finally saw her strength, it would be too late. The whispers of neighbors also changed. They began to notice Maria's visits to the bank and market. Some admired her courage, others doubted her, but Maria didn't care. She was no longer living to please others. She was living to claim the respect she deserved. Daniel's friends continued to visit, but Maria no longer paid them any attention. She carried herself with a quiet pride that made even some of them uncomfortable. They could laugh all they wanted, but Maria's silence was no longer weakness. It was power. As the weeks passed, Maria began to take steps toward selling her land. She met with a lawyer, signed papers, and received an amount that was enough to change her path. She didn't tell Daniel a word about it. To him, nothing seemed different, but in truth, everything was changing. That night, As Maria lay in her bed, she thought of her husband. She whispered, "I will not let our son's pride destroy me. I will stand tall." For the first time in years, she slept peacefully. She knew the journey ahead would be hard, but she also knew that her decision had already freed her spirit. Maria's days began to take on a new shape. On the surface, everything looked almost the same. She still woke early, still cooked simple meals, still went to her cleaning jobs. But beneath the surface, her life was shifting. Her mind no longer carried the weight of humiliation alone, now it carried plans. She felt like a tree that had been battered by storms yet had begun to grow fresh roots, stronger and deeper. Daniel, on the other hand, continued to fall into the same routine. He woke late, spent most of his time with friends, and came home only when he needed food or rest. He believed his mother's silence meant she had accepted his behavior. To him, she was still the same woman who would always be there, cooking, cleaning, and forgiving. He did not notice the glint of resolve in her eyes. He was too blinded by his pride. One afternoon, Maria returned from her job carrying a brown envelope. Inside were the documents from the sale of her land. She placed the envelope carefully in a wooden box and locked it. That box now held her future. With the money, she had already made her first small investment by supporting Clara's growing business at the market. Clara used part of the funds to buy more supplies, and in return, she promised Maria a fair share of the profit. For Maria, this was not just about money, it was about finally stepping into a world where she had control. Each evening, when Clara visited to share updates, Maria listened closely. She asked about sales, customers, and what new products were in demand. At first, Clara was surprised by Maria's sharp questions, but soon she realized that Maria's mind was sharp and disciplined. Together, they began planning to expand the business from a small market stall to a proper shop. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his careless ways. He often mocked his mother in front of his friends. Sometimes, he called her names. Other times, he ignored her completely, acting as if she were invisible. His arrogance grew each day. One evening, while his friends were drinking in the living room, Daniel shouted, "Why don't you serve us something, old woman? That's all you're good for." His friends laughed, but Maria no longer reacted as she once did. She did not cry. She did not plead. She only looked at him with quiet eyes and walked away. Daniel mistook her calmness for weakness, but in reality, it was the silence of someone who had already decided to rise above the insult. Maria had reached a point where his words no longer broke her spirit. Instead, they confirmed her choice to live differently. Weeks passed, and the business began to grow. Maria would go to the market early in the morning before her job, helping Clara set up the stall. She observed how customers behaved, how some bargained, and how others looked for quality above price. She noticed which items sold quickly and which ones stayed behind. Slowly, she began to understand the rhythm of trade. Her small share of profit began to add up. Maria placed every coin carefully into a separate box, never touching it for personal needs. She told herself that this money would one day buy her independence completely. Each time she added to the box, she felt her strength returning. Daniel, however, remained blind to her actions. He was too busy trying to impress his friends. He borrowed money from them, spent it on parties, and often came home demanding food without even asking how his mother was. One evening, he brought his friends again, boasting loudly about how one day he would buy a big house and live like a king. Maria listened from the kitchen, her lips pressed together. She wanted to laugh at his empty words, but she held back. She knew that in time, reality would speak louder than his arrogance. One day, Clara suggested they rent a small shop together. "We can't stay in the market forever," she said. "If we have a shop, people will take us more seriously. And you, Maria, you could help manage it." You have a way of talking to people with calmness that wins their trust. Maria thought about it all night. The next day, she opened her wooden box and counted her savings. It was enough to take the step. She agreed to Clara's plan. Within weeks, they rented a small space on a busy street. The shop was modest but clean, and they painted the walls a soft white. Together, they arranged shelves, placed goods neatly, and hung a sign outside. For Maria, it was more than just a shop. It was a symbol of a new beginning. When the shop opened, Maria stood behind the counter with Clara. Customers came in, and Maria greeted each one with warmth and respect. Her kind smile and gentle words made people feel welcome. Soon, more and more customers began returning. They didn't just come for the goods, they came because they liked the way Maria treated them. Back at home, Daniel noticed his mother leaving early and returning late. He grew suspicious. "Where are you going all the time?" he asked one evening. Maria only replied, "Don't worry about me. Worry about yourself." Her calm response annoyed him, but he shrugged it off. He believed his mother was simply wasting time. But weeks later, one of Daniel's friends walked past the shop and saw Maria behind the counter. He rushed to tell Daniel, laughing. "Your old mother is working in a shop now, serving customers like some servant," he mocked. Daniel's pride was wounded. He stormed home that night and shouted, "Is it true? Are you standing in some shop like a beggar?" Maria looked at him firmly for the first time. "I am not a beggar," she said softly. "I am a worker. And one day, you will understand the difference." Daniel grew angry, but he could not change her. The more he insulted her, the more determined she became. He didn't know that behind the scenes, her profits were growing, and her position was becoming stronger. Maria's life had reached a turning point. She no longer felt trapped in her own home. She no longer felt like a servant to her son's pride. She had her own purpose, her own dignity, and her own future taking shape. She understood now that her revenge would not be through anger or shouting. It would be through success that would one day make Daniel realize what he had lost. That night, as she closed the shop and counted the day's earnings, Maria smiled. She whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." Maria's shop became more than just a place of business, it became a place of healing for her spirit. Each morning she rose early, dressed neatly, and walked to the little shop she and Clara managed. The pride she felt when turning the key in the lock could not be explained in words. For the first time in her life, she owned something that gave her not only money but dignity. Customers greeted her warmly, and some even called her auntie with respect. Every smile she received was like a small stitch repairing the wound Daniel had left in her heart. Clara often told Maria, "You have a gift. People feel safe with you. They trust your words." And it was true. Many buyers came back again and again, not because the goods were extraordinary, but because they valued the honest, kind way Maria treated them. Slowly, the profits grew. With each week that passed, Maria's box of savings grew heavier. Back at home, Daniel remained blind to his mother's transformation. He continued to boast in front of his friends about dreams of wealth he never worked for. He still treated Maria like a shadow in the house, never asking where she went or how she spent her days. But Maria's silence was different now. It was not the silence of pain, it was the silence of someone preparing for a future that would leave him behind. Months passed, and Maria and Clara decided to expand the shop. They bought more products, added new shelves, and even hired a young assistant to help during busy hours. Maria began to feel proud of herself in a way she never had before. She was no longer only a mother who sacrificed, she was a woman who had created something of her own. One evening, after a long day at the shop, Maria sat at her table at home and looked at her documents. She had quietly bought a small new house in her name using the profits and savings she had gathered. It was not huge, but it was clean, modern, and completely hers. She planned everything carefully, not telling Daniel a word. For too long she had lived in a house where her dignity was trampled. Now she was ready to move forward. The timing of her plan became clear one afternoon when Daniel returned home with his friends. They were laughing loudly, drinking, and boasting as usual. At one point, Daniel looked at his mother and said, "Old woman, you will always live here serving me. That's your role." His friends roared with laughter. Maria stood still for a moment. Then she calmly said, "No, Daniel. That is not my role anymore." Her voice was steady, and the room fell silent for a moment. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but there was something in her tone that unsettled him. A week later, Maria gathered her belongings quietly. She packed only what was truly hers, leaving behind the rest. When Daniel was out, she moved into her new home. She locked the door behind her and whispered, "This is my freedom." The next morning, when Daniel returned with his friends and found the house empty, he was shocked. The kitchen had no fresh food waiting for him. The bed in Maria's room was bare. He searched the house in confusion before realizing she had truly left. Anger boiled inside him. He stormed out, shouting in the street, but Maria did not return. News spread quickly through the neighborhood. People were astonished that Maria had moved out and bought her own place. Many admired her courage. Some even said, she should have done this long ago. For Daniel, it was a deep embarrassment. His friends, who once laughed with him at his mother, now laughed at him. "Your mother is stronger than you," they teased. "She built a life while you wasted yours." Maria, meanwhile, lived peacefully in her new home. She furnished it with simple things she loved: a small sofa, a clean table, a shelf of books, and curtains she chose herself. Each item reminded her that she was no longer a servant in her own house but the owner of her life. At the shop, business continued to thrive. Clara praised her for her wisdom and kindness. "Without you, I could not have grown this much," she admitted. Maria smiled and said, "Without faith, neither of us could have." Daniel, left alone in the old house, began to feel the weight of reality. Without his mother, the house grew dirty and empty. The meals he once mocked were gone. His clothes piled up unwashed. His friends, seeing his weakness, slowly stopped visiting. The laughter that once filled the house was replaced by silence. One day, out of desperation, Daniel came to Maria's shop. He stood outside, watching her speak warmly to customers, her face glowing with confidence. He saw respect in the eyes of those around her, respect he had never given her. For the first time, he realized how much he had underestimated his mother. When Maria noticed him standing there, she did not rush to greet him. She finished with her customer first, then looked at him calmly. "What do you want, Daniel?" she asked. Her tone was not cruel, but it carried authority. Daniel stammered, I need help. Things are not easy." Maria looked at him, her heart heavy but firm. "You thought I would always serve you," she said. "But life does not reward pride. It rewards respect. If you cannot respect others, you cannot expect help from them." With that, she turned back to her work, leaving him to stand there in shame. Daniel walked away with his head down. His friends' laughter echoed in his memory, but now it was directed at him. He felt smaller than he ever had before. For Maria, the moment was a turning point. She did not feel anger anymore. She felt free. Her revenge was not in hurting her son but in showing him the strength he never believed she had. She had risen quietly, and now the whole world could see it. That evening, Maria sat in her new home, sipping tea by the window. She thought of her journey, the years of sacrifice, the night of humiliation, the decision to rise, and the courage to take control of her life. She knew her story was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. She whispered softly to herself, respect is worth more than gold. And now, I have both. Maria's life in her new home soon became steady and peaceful. She woke each day with a sense of purpose that she had never known before. The humiliation she once suffered in silence no longer weighed on her heart. Instead, she carried herself with calm strength. The shop she co-owned with Clara was running smoothly, and their profits increased month after month. Maria no longer worried about survival. She could finally focus on living with dignity. But Daniel's life was moving in the opposite direction. After Maria left, the old house turned into a place of emptiness. His friends, who once crowded the rooms with laughter and noise, no longer came around. Without Maria's cooking, the meals stopped. Without her cleaning, the house quickly became messy and unpleasant. Daniel tried to maintain his pride, but it became harder every day. He realized that what he had taken for granted, food, comfort, and even a welcoming home, had always been his mother's work. Now that she was gone, he felt exposed. At first, Daniel thought Maria's decision was temporary. He told himself, she will come back. She has nowhere else to go. But weeks turned into months, and she did not return. Instead, he began hearing stories from neighbors about her shop and her success. Some even told him directly, your mother is respected now. She has built something of her own. Every word stung his pride like a wound. One afternoon, Daniel finally swallowed his arrogance and went to see Maria again. He arrived at her shop, expecting to find her tired or struggling. Instead, he saw her surrounded by customers who spoke to her kindly and with respect. She looked healthier, happier, and stronger than she ever had at home. The sight shocked him. For the first time, he realized that she did not need him, but he had always needed her. When the shop quieted down, Daniel approached. Mother, he began, trying to soften his tone. I made mistakes. Can we start over? His words trembled, not from love but from desperation. He had nothing left, and he wanted her to provide for him again. Maria looked at him carefully. In her heart, she still felt the bond of a mother. She still remembered the little boy she had once carried, the child she had sacrificed everything for. But she also remembered the night he kicked her in front of his friends, the insults, the humiliation, and the years of disrespect. She knew that forgiving him easily would only invite the same treatment again. She placed her hand on the counter and said calmly, Daniel, love without respect is empty. I gave you everything, and you treated me as nothing. I will not go back to that life. Her words were firm, but they were not cruel. They carried the weight of truth. Daniel lowered his head, unable to respond. He left the shop in silence, his heart filled with shame. From that day forward, Maria's success became known throughout the neighborhood. People admired her journey. They spoke about how a mother, once insulted and humiliated, had risen with quiet strength. Some even came to her for advice, asking how she had managed to change her life. Maria always smiled and said, never let anyone decide your worth. Respect begins with yourself. Meanwhile, Daniel's downfall grew heavier. Without support, he struggled to find work. His careless habits and poor reputation made it difficult for anyone to trust him. The same friends who once laughed with him now avoided him. He walked the streets alone, thinking of the home that was no longer his and the mother who had found freedom without him. There were days when he stood outside Maria's new house, staring at the light glowing from her window. He wanted to knock, to beg her forgiveness, but his pride stopped him. Each time, he walked away, carrying the weight of regret on his shoulders. Maria, inside her home, sometimes thought of him too. She still prayed for him, because she was a mother at heart. But she knew that her revenge had already been carried out. It was not revenge born from anger or violence. It was revenge born from growth, from showing her son that arrogance destroys and respect builds. She had chosen to build, while he had chosen to destroy. And now, their lives reflected those choices. Her business with Clara grew into a well-known shop in the town. They hired more workers, expanded their products, and even opened a second location. Maria became a figure of quiet inspiration. People often said, "She is proof that it is never too late to rise." Daniel, on the other hand, was left behind. His pride, once so large, had crumbled. His arrogance had destroyed the very support he needed. He faced the truth that his downfall was not his mother's fault but his own. One evening, as Maria sat in her home with a cup of tea, she reflected on her journey. She thought about the years of sacrifice, the night of humiliation, and the strength it took to walk away. She knew life was not easy, but she also knew she had found peace. She whispered softly, "Respect is worth more than gold. And I have it now." Maria's revenge was complete. It did not involve shouting, fighting, or bitterness. It was simple but powerful. She lived a life of dignity, success, and self-respect, while her son faced the emptiness of his own choices. Her revenge destroyed his pride, and in doing so, it freed her forever.